Weird, eccentric, reclusive, direct. These are some of the many words that people use to describe Emily Dickinson and her poetry. She led an unconventional lifestyle, spending most of her years in social isolation, writing poetry, talking to people through doors, and exclusively wearing the same white dress. While Emily was alive, she was considered a character to the public, a local legend of sorts, and after her death she remains an object of fascination. Her deeply personal and eccentric literature made Dickinson one of the most influential poets of the 19th century. She wrote in a strikingly modern style and refused to conform to the rules of poetry. As stated by her brother, she, quote, saw things directly and just as they were. Long after her death, Dickinson's mind has been picked apart by scholars. They are endlessly fascinated by her unconventional expression. However, they believe that something had to be fundamentally wrong with Dickinson in order for her to be so defiant of social norms. Psychiatrists perversely see her as a scientific case study, attempting to medicalize and pathologize her actions. Epilepsy, hysteria, bipolar disorder, they have tried to diagnose Emily with everything, but none of it quite seemed to fit. In this video, we are going to challenge the psychiatric labels often placed on Emily Dickinson in order to consider how her lifestyle and poetry actually reflect a very autistic way of experiencing the world. Instead of viewing autism as a pathology, we will be viewing it as a cognitive difference. The pathological model, or medical model, views autism as a disease, an abnormality that should be actively cured, treated, or prevented. It gives doctors the power to dictate our choices, but the cognitive model, or the neurodiversity model, encourages a view of autism as a natural variation in the human brain. This model encourages society to accommodate and accept autistic needs, instead of expecting us to conform. It also gives autistics the autonomy to express themselves in a way that they seem is right. We will use this cognitive model in order to understand Emily's life through her own lens. This video seeks to legitimize Emily's voice. We won't treat her as a patient. Instead, we will use autism as another way of understanding her life and literature. This approach can not only shed new light on her work, but it can connect autistics like myself to the past. Even if they were not called autistic, people on the spectrum have always existed, and historical analysis reveals that they actually played a huge part in shaping art, science, and especially literature. This video is intended for everyone. You don't have to be autistic to watch this video because, regardless, I think you'll find Emily Dickinson's poetry to be incredibly relatable because she deals with modern topics and writes in such a modern style. Anyways, if this is the first time you're seeing me, I would love if you guys could subscribe to this channel. It can help me make more videos like this. And if you want to support me further, I do have a Patreon. Just go on patreon.com/meekalefe. There you can get access to exclusive posts, and you can join my Patreon-only Discord server to chat with like-minded history nerds and humanities lovers alike. Thank you guys so much. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I do have a new microphone and a new camera, if you guys noticed, so hopefully you guys enjoy the new quality. Okay, let's get started. Much madness is divinest sense. To a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority. In this, as all, prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous, and handled with a chain. This is one of the many poems that Emily wrote about her own eccentricity and her own madness. Here she's trying to convey the frustrations that she has with society's treatment of people who are different. She resists society's desire to contain these people, and goes as far to say that their way of viewing the world is superior, You see, when she was young, she was a victim of this ostracization when she was locked in a closet due to her hyperactivity. Emily hated the condescending language of psychiatrists and medical professionals. So what makes an autistic analysis of her poetry any different? Isn't this video hypocritical? Well, autism as a condition arose in the 1900s because of the growing field of medicine, specifically psychiatry. The popular definition of autism is a modern one. It's a pathology, a scientific way of categorizing human brains into those with deficits and those without. Those who can effectively participate in capitalist society and those who have difficulty with it. Disabled bodies were regarded as an object of analysis instead of a subject. They were not seen as sentient human beings with their own emotions, souls, and minds. Now, there are some positives that came with the medicalization of autism. For example, diagnosed autistic people have the medical credibility now to receive accommodations for work and school, at least on paperwork, because the bureaucracy is just terrible. It's very difficult to get accommodations. However, when it comes to historical analysis, this medical lens can be limiting. This video will try its best not to analyze Emily as an object, but as a subject. We will treat her poetry as a means of self-expression, not a criteria for diagnosing illness. We will see how she experienced the social and sensory worlds differently from her counterparts. You see, human brains are incredibly diverse and cannot be split into the binary of normal and deficient. For this video, we are going to be analyzing autism as a neurotype instead of a pathology. In other words, autism is one of the many different ways that the human brain can be wired. However, I would still consider it to be a disability, not because our brains are broken, but because we live in a society dominated by neurotypicals. There are far more of them than there are of us, and society is built by them and for them. In other words, it's society itself that disables us. Now, what about using autism before it existed as a category? Well, autism existed throughout history, and way before the development of psychiatry, but they were not treated as patients. For example, in early modern Europe, autistics were called idiots and fools, and even went on to occupy prominent court positions as jesters. I have a whole video on that if you're interested. Autism is a fascinating perspective for analyzing history because it relates a person to their society. Let's take special interests, for example. Special interests are intense fascinations that autistics have with a particular topic or hobby. It's an overwhelming feeling of connection and can consume a large part of our everyday lives. We will know a lot about the subject. In the modern age, people make fun of autistic girls with a special interest in horses and have even gone on to make a whole character out of it called the Horse Girl. But back in the day, it would most likely elevate your societal position, when knowledge about horses was more important to the functioning of society. You see, passion as a negative trait is a very capitalist conception. Since knowing a lot about horses isn't exactly profitable, it is seen as weird and cringe. I hope you guys can see how society's treatment of autistic people varies from time to place. Furthermore, autistic brains aren't wired to immediately accept or understand the importance of social hierarchies, and we have a reputation for being pretty blunt and straightforward. So analyzing the experience of autistic individuals can tell us a lot about societies of the past, the way that they're organized, their flaws, their struggles, their moral codes. Emily Dickinson's poems are a great way of observing autistic culture because she didn't write for an audience. She only published 10 of her 1,700 poems. The rest of her writing was published after her death. It is in these unfiltered and deeply personal works that we can explore the autistic experience in 1800s America. Emily Dickinson's odd behavior has been the subject of ruthless interrogation by scholars who attempt to pathologize her behavior. For example, in 1971, the psychiatrist John Cody published an entire biography about Emily Dickinson in which he insisted that her odd behavior was solely a result of her family trauma. Other scholars suggest that her self-isolation was due to her failed love life. However, what these scholars could never explain is why she was eccentric since birth. Dickinson was born in 1830 to a well-off, upper-middle-class family in Amherst, Massachusetts. During this time, society did not treat the cognitively disabled very well. In 1848, the early disability rights activist Samuel Gridley Howe reported the living conditions of disabled people. He visited over 100 towns in Massachusetts to investigate the treatment of idiots. This was a popular term used to describe people that we would now say have mental disabilities. The term right now is considered very offensive, but back in the day, that is the term that they used to describe these people. Among the idiots that were examined, many of them exhibited autistic traits like being nonverbal, having sensory sensitivities, and having an acute sense of pattern recognition. Along with the researcher Dorothea Dix, he discovered that many impoverished families were abandoning their idiot children. In the best cases, these children were sent off to prisons and houses for the poor. In the worst cases, they were chained to barns, locked up in attics and basements, and sometimes even kept in outdoor pens with the livestock. Now, reading this report was very hard, and it's easy to get angry at these families for their neglect. However, it's important to recognize the impact of class on these horrific living conditions. These were children of impoverished families, families that did not have the resources or the time to take care of their children with higher support needs. It's really quite horrible to say, but they felt the need to make sacrifices in order to survive because the state did not provide them with that support, or they simply couldn't afford it. Emily exhibited many of the traits that Howe described in his report on the idiots. However, she wasn't abandoned by her family because they came from money. This difference tells us a lot about disability in the 19th century. It specifically tells us that it was up to individual families to determine the fate of disabled folk. It was a domestic concern instead of an institutional one. Furthermore, unlike today, disability was not seen as something that needed to be cured, at least mental disability. Since it was seen as a domestic concern, there was no big effort to normalize them or integrate them into society. The poor disabled were abandoned, and the wealthy ones were allowed to seclude themselves and be hermits and pursue their passions. Similarly, instead of being treated as a burden, Dickinson's autistic traits were regarded as simply eccentric. Emily was the middle child of a politically conservative father and an emotionally distant and cold mother. In her first few years of education, she attended a small local school called Amherst Academy. She was a really smart girl and received high grades in classical subjects. However, outside of her academic excellence, she did not have the best upbringing by her parents, and she faced a series of deaths of people that were close to her. In her teenage years, she experienced the death of her best friend, Sophia Holland. This impacted her tremendously. She fell physically ill and could hardly attend school anymore because of the way she was acting. She was sent off to recover with family in Boston and returned much better. However, this event instilled in her a deep fixation with death that never really went away. After graduating from Amherst Academy, Dickinson went to study at Mount Holyoke, a female seminary, from the years 1847 to 1848. This was the first school in America that provided higher education for women. There, Emily was encouraged to pursue science and other subjects that were typically reserved for men. She loved these classes, got near perfect exam results, and reported to her brother once in a letter that she was, quote, all engrossed in the history of sulfuric acid. Academically, she thrived in this environment, but socially she stood out. You see, despite its rather progressive emphasis on expanding education for women, Mount Holyoke was an evangelical institution. Weekly check-ins were conducted about women on their faith. According to the Poetry Foundation, the young women were divided into 3 categories: those who were, quote, established Christians, those who, quote, expressed hope, and those who, quote, were without hope. According to legend, Emily was one of the only students that was without hope. During this period in her life, Emily questioned her faith heavily. She was a Christian, but not in the typical sense. She hated going to church and preferred to pray by herself. She hated the rules and the customs of institutional Christianity. However, she did not feel the need to conform or give up her beliefs in order to be accepted into society. In fact, one of her classmates recalls a moment in which the head of Mount Holyoke asked the girls if they were Christian, they should rise and stand up. Everyone but Emily stood up. When asked why she made the decision, she, quote, "They thought it queer I didn't rise. I thought a lie would be queerer." Emily has so many one-liners like this. She's iconic. Emily attended Mount Holyoke for only 1 year. According to her brother, William Austin Dickinson, Emily began to withdraw from society at this time, when she was just around 18 to 20 years old. There is a solitude of space, a solitude of sea, a solitude of death, but these societies shall be compared with the profounder sight, that polar privacy, a soul admitted to itself, finite infinity. This poem displays an acute awareness of the difference between solitude and privacy. As we learned earlier in this video, Emily was prone to self-isolation from a young age. Being unable to process the death of her best friend in an acceptable fashion, she retreated from society. Starting in her 20s, Dickinson began to retreat further and further into solitude, a decision that has been endlessly questioned and pathologized by her biographers. They contrast her vibrant and sociable young self to her reclusive and quiet adult self. They often portray these two Emilys as diametrically opposed to one another. It was as if she became an entirely different person. But they never stopped to consider the fact that maybe she just grew up. The way that other people describe Emily's transition into adulthood resonated with me heavily as an autistic woman. You see, when you're a child, you don't have autonomy and you don't fully understand the world. As an autistic child, it's especially difficult to have your voice heard. People mistake your passiveness as innocence, but children also have their own souls and desires. They just don't have the capacity or autonomy to be able to express them yet. On the other hand, there is a lot of freedom to childhood. Specifically, children are less pressured to follow social rules because they are accepted to be at the learning stage of their life. When Dickinson was a child, she didn't have to worry about the way that she was being perceived. Society, etiquette, and romance. In fact, according to Julie Brown, she had no boundaries when it came to her friendships. Quote, "As a girl, she was too intense in her friendships with other girls her age, crushing them with her insistent, fervent cries for closeness and love." As autistics age, we start to notice these rejections more and more. It starts to become a confusing pattern. You become frustrated by society because you're either being perceived as overbearing or emotionally absent. This has an impact on autistics in their adolescence, which often leads to depression and alienation. Some of us decide that the best path is into our own brain. Solitude is comforting because nobody is perceiving you. You don't have to act. Entertain ourselves by our own imaginations, by drawing, painting, writing, creating. We participate in society by escaping through art and culture, by watching movies, shows, reading books, playing games. To the young Emily Dickinson, she found comfort in this alone time. She lived with her family, tended to her garden, indulged in her writing. She found no need for conventional social life outside of this. Make no mistake, she still had many friends, but she preferred to communicate with them through writing letters. She states, quote, "A letter always feels to me like immortality, because it's the mind alone with a corporeal friend. Indebted in our talk to attitude and accent, there seems a spectral power in thought that walks alone." This quote also resonated with me heavily as an autistic person. She feels a need to focus on, quote, attitude and accent, restricting her ability to communicate. She describes a mind-body disconnect that many of us on the spectrum face. This disconnect can manifest in several different ways. It can result in awkward body language because we're mechanically moving our bodies. These experiences lead many of us in the modern age to prefer digital company, internet friends. And similar to how the internet allows autistics to transcend our physical forms, Dickinson's letters allowed her to escape her own corporal prison. Furthermore, autistic brains take longer to process things, which makes it difficult to communicate with people on the spot. The speed at which people expect us to listen, comprehend, and come up with a response can feel extremely fast. This is why our conversations can often end up in awkwardness and miscommunication. With Emily, her communication style was perceived as intense and overbearing. Communicating through writing allowed her to take time to understand her emotions, collect her thoughts, and deliberately choose her words. She chose a way of communication that was most comfortable for her. It's wrong to characterize her physical isolation as social isolation. She lived with her family and maintained relationships with several individuals through her writing. Sometimes she even had visitors over. She just talked to them through closed doors. This is incredibly relatable to the autistic experience because sometimes even being in the same physical presence as somebody else is overwhelming. Speaking through a door allowed her to express her thoughts without concern for body language. She was also known to bake treats and give them to local children by lowering a basket from her window to the ground floor. These are a few of the many ways in which she interacted with society while maintaining a physical distance. She would be a COVID warrior. Another example of her social life is her friendships. For example, she had a deep connection with her father's law student, Benjamin Franklin Newton. He was around 10 years older than her and occupied a mentor-like position in her life. As an avid reader himself, he recommended literature to Emily that inspired her. She wrote about him saying, quote, "Mr. Newton became to me a gentle yet grave preceptor, teaching me what to read, what authors to admire, what was most grand or beautiful in nature, and that sublimer lesson, a faith in things unseen." He too admired Emily and saw her as a protege, encouraging her to pursue her literary passions. While many speculate that they had a romantic relationship, their language suggests that this was far from the case. However, Emily was not a stranger to romantic love. She had in her youth plenty of crushes, especially on women. When she was 14, she wrote this wonderful little tidbit. She states, quote, "She is tall and rather slender, but finely proportioned. She has a most witching pair of blue eyes, rich brown hair, delicate complexion, cheeks which vie with the opening rosebud, teeth like pearls, dimples which come and go like the little ripples in yonder merry brook. And she is so affectionate, lovely. Forgive my glowing description, for you know I'm always in love with my teachers." I love this quote so much. She's so funny. I love her. She's iconic. Now, Emily had many casual crushes like this in her lifetime. They were men and women that she looked up to, admired, and fantasized about. These feelings would come and go, but never really became anything serious. However, this all changed in the summer of 1850 when Emily met Susan Gilbert, her neighbor, her muse, and her lover. She stated that this was the summer when, quote, "love first began, on the step at the front door and under the evergreens." Despite Emily's relative isolation during this period, she spent an enormous amount of time with Susan. They read each other poetry, took long walks in the woods together, exchanged literature, etc. When Susan was away, Emily missed her terribly. In 1852 letter to Susan, she states, quote, "When you come home, darling, I shan't have your letters, shall I? But I shall have yourself, which is more. Oh, more and better than I can even think. I sit here with my little whip, cracking the time away." My girl was stimming, oh my god. "Till not an hour is left of it, and there you are. Here, and joy is here, joy now and forevermore." If your partner doesn't talk to you like this, leave them. Her love for Susan embodied the autistic experience of love. Because of societal rules and expectations surrounding dating, many autistics struggle to find love. But that doesn't mean we're incapable of love, we just struggle with the game of it all. In other words, the rules surrounding love are unbearable for us. When we love somebody, masking our feelings is difficult, which makes a lot of neurotypical people uncomfortable. However, sometimes that special person will just appear in your life, whether or not you play the dating game. Emily's most cherished romance happened during her period of isolation. when she wasn't expected to mask her identity to appease the feelings of others. By spending quality time alone, Emily was able to embrace her eccentricity and channel it into her passion. Thus, she attracted people that valued her authentic self and not behind the mask she hid. It's really quite inspiring to read. How vain it seems to write when one knows how to feel. How much more near and dear to sit beside you, talk with you, hear the tones of your voice. Give me strength, Susie. Write me of hope and love, and of hearts that endure. Emily's desire for physical proximity embodies the often contradictory elements of autistic socialization and our different way of processing senses. Emily Dickinson was known to talk through doors, preferred written communication, and kept herself company. Autistics feel overstimulated by our physical senses and emotions. Being around people can make this worse, so we build up these protective walls around ourselves. This pattern behavior should not be treated as an illness or an internal problem. It's simply our body's way of regulating ourselves. Neurotypicals do it as well. Everyone needs alone time, but autistics require it more. But autistics can also feel understimulated, and sometimes we desperately desire physical and emotional intimacy with a trusted friend or partner. We often prefer to spend time with people one-on-one because it minimizes social pressure and fosters a much deeper relationship. Emily states, quote, "You will forgive me, for I never visit. I am from the fields, you know, and, while quite at home with the dandelion, make sorry figure in a drawing room. Did you ask me out with a bunch of daisies? I should say thank you and accept." In social environments such as this drawing room, Emily Dickinson struggled to find that connection. The drawing room was a place of socialization where family and friends would host social events and gatherings. Emily says here that she prefers one-on-one time in areas far from civilization, far from the judging eyes of society. Emily was able to have that connection with Susan, with their long walks in the woods and time at home. Spending alone time with Susan allowed her to thrive. Susan was a grounding force in her life. Emily struggled with having a sensory system that was always working on overdrive. Like many autistics, loud sounds were absolutely unbearable for her. She hated thunderstorms and would clamp her hands over her ears whenever they would happen, attempting to drown out the sound. To autistics, sounds are not only louder, but reverberate in our heads like an echoey cave. This is why a lot of us use noise-canceling headphones or earplugs to drown out the sound. However, Susan's presence was able to drown out these noises. According to Emily, quote, "Oh, Susie, I would nestle close to your warm heart and never hear the wind blow or the storm beat again. Is there any room there for me, or shall I wander away, homeless and alone? Thank you for loving me, darling." She was her everything. She was accepting, kind, intelligent, and most importantly, she was non-judgmental. Susan was the most important person in her life. Over the years, she received over 250 poems from Emily. She admired her more than anyone, once even stating that, quote, "Dear Sue, with the exception of Shakespeare, you have told me more knowledge than anyone living." To say that is sincerely strange praise. If an autistic person compares you to their special interest, there is no doubt about it, they are head over heels in love with you. Unfortunately, this relationship was rocky due to their historical circumstances. You see, Susan married Emily's brother, Austen Dickinson, in 1856. Some scholars suggest that this marriage was strategically meant to remain close to Emily, but we will never truly know the answer to that. The popular narrative surrounding Emily Dickinson portrays her life as a steady decline into solitude. The poetry she produced during this period, a product of her broken state. However, this perspective removes her autonomy and undermines her beliefs. She deliberately chose to prioritize her special interest, poetry, over a conventional social life. I think a lot about how if Emily Dickinson was born a male, he would have been portrayed as passionate and committed to his work instead of a mentally ill genius. This is because, on top of her different neurotype, Emily was a woman. While her male counterparts were encouraged to lead unconventional lives, women were expected to conform and follow the rules of society. This is a double standard that still exists today. While men are more likely to receive an autism diagnosis early on in their lives, women often go undiagnosed because social rules are drilled into them at a young age. They are forced to mask from the very beginning. When autistic women exhibit abnormal traits and defy expectations, their autonomy is undermined. Their behavior is blamed on external factors, from failed love lives to family trauma. But they rarely stop to consider the fact that maybe they just didn't care for social norms. Emily Dickinson remained in solitude until her death in 1886. In these 30 to 40 years of isolation, she produced revolutionary literature that embodied the autistic experience. The poetry she produced during her time of solitude can tell us a lot about autistic life in the 19th century. So autistic brains are wired differently from neurotypical brains. Scientists have observed that autistic brains make different kinds of connections to neurotypical brains. Autistic brains make more local connections than regional. The best analogy I can use to describe this mode of thinking is regional versus local public transportation, which is a very autistic analogy, I will say. A regional train that takes you from one city to another will make less short stops, but will cover more distance. A local train, however, will make more stops, but will cover shorter distance. This is why neurotypicals often look at the big picture of things, while autistics tend to focus on the smaller details. None is better than the other, they're simply different ways of thinking. The local connectivity of autistic brains can manifest in several different ways, from our intense special interests to writing style. Emily's writing style heavily reflects the autistic way of thinking. According to Julie Brown, quote, Emily Dickinson wrote her poems on pieces of paper she cut into small squares that she stitched together into little booklets she called, quote, fascicles? I think that's how you say it. Autistic brains have to manually put together their local ideas like this in order to see the big picture of things. It's difficult to visualize it all in our head. In her poetry, Emily expressed her fragmented thought patterns. She states in one poem, quote, I feel a cleaving in my mind, as if my brain had split. I tried to match it, seam by seam, but could not make them seem to fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence raveled out of reach like balls upon a floor. This poem embodies how the autistic brain works. Reading this was insane because that's exactly how my brain works. It was kind of scary. Trying to put my thoughts onto paper and words is extremely difficult, which is part of the reason it takes me so long to make these video essays, because essays are difficult. I know I'm a history major, but they're difficult. There's so much going on up here that it's overwhelming. It feels like coming up with a cohesive thought is like putting pieces of a puzzle together. Emily was especially good at detail-oriented descriptions, which is part of the reason that she was so good at writing short snippets. Poetry. Just listen to her describe an observation of a bird that was hunting. Quote, a bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all around. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head like one in danger, cautious. I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers, and rode them softer home than oars divide the ocean. Too silver for a seam, or butterflies off banks of noon leap plashless as they swim. Furthermore, since autistics have a difficult time putting ourselves in other people's shoes, our thinking is largely internal. Emily's writings are largely concerned with her own internal experiences, and when they aren't about her, they're about the nature and her surroundings, the animals and the non-human. What is cool about Emily is that she recognizes her brain and doesn't push against it. Instead, she proudly embraces her difference. In a poem, she states, quote, the brain within its groove runs evenly and true, but let a splinter swerve, 'twere easier for you to put a current back where floods have slit the hills. and scooped a turnpike for themselves and trodden out the mills. Emily Dickinson died in 1886. After her death, there was a massive increase in institutions for the handicapped, not as a means of providing support, but as a means of weeding out societal deviance. Institutions began to take a social Darwinist approach to disability, treating them as the weaklings of society. The rise of eugenics by Sir Francis Galton promoted the idea that disabilities should be prevented to produce a strong and fit population. In the early 1900s, America opened its first institutions to sterilize people with disabilities, leading to the systematic oppression of disabled bodies for decades to come. Emily Dickinson existed in this twilight, this transition from domestic to institutional treatment of the disabled. Due to her wealth, she was able to escape a lot of the physical domestic abuse that autistics endured. Don't get me wrong, her upbringing was still heavily traumatic. Her parents were not the most emotionally available, and she faced death at a very young age. But compared to her counterparts, she led a relatively fulfilling life. She was not abandoned or forced to conform to a society that didn't accept her. Because of her parents' wealth, she was able to channel all of her energy into her writing, and she did not feel the need to seek status in society. Emily's poetry shows that autistics have a profound impact on art and culture. She challenged society from her youth, standing against her school's evangelicism, not because of any radical interpretation of the church, but because she simply did not see the necessity in their rules and rituals. In her poetry, she challenged the standard convention. Her rhymes were off, her rhythm was unique. She embraced her fragmented thoughts and ideas in a way that was interpreted as revolutionary, as modern and avant-garde. Furthermore, autistic people struggle to understand our own thoughts and emotions, and writing helped her with this. She uses metaphors to express her feelings in a way that makes sense to her. This way of thinking produced art that broke boundaries and created new avenues for poets to express themselves. I could sit here all day and pick apart the literal thousands of poems that she wrote, but that would take hours. I think the poems that I selected shows how Emily Dickinson's writing and lifestyle mirror the autistic experience. And I hope this analysis can contribute to the formation of an autistic cultural identity, an autistic history. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. As always, thank you to my lovely patrons for supporting my content. You guys mean the world to me. You're amazing. And I finally have a new microphone. Yay, I'm so happy. And camera. But I hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye bye!